What happens when American exports to one of Africa's most closely watched nations suddenly jump by more than 25%, but that African country sells almost nothing back? In 2025, United States goods exports to Burkina Faso climbed to roughly $68.2 million. At first, that sounds like a success story. More trade, more equipment, more products crossing borders, more opportunities for businesses on both sides. But then comes the number that changes the entire picture. The United States imported only about $5.1 million in goods from Burkina Faso. That left a goods trade gap of roughly $63.1 million in America's favor. So what are we really looking at? Is Burkina Faso becoming more dependent on foreign products? Or is the country importing the machinery, equipment, and productive inputs it needs to build something much larger at home? That distinction matters, because a nation can import because it cannot produce. But a nation can also import because it is preparing to produce more tomorrow. And under Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso has increasingly placed agriculture, domestic production, and economic sovereignty at the center of its national conversation. If you follow Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, and Africa's economic transformation, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments. Does this $63 million gap concern you, or could it be part of a much bigger transition? Because far from customs reports and trade statistics, another number has been rising in Burkina Faso, and this one is coming from the fields. What if the real answer to Burkina Faso's trade gap is already growing in the soil? The $63.1 million gap looks dramatic, but a trade deficit by itself does not tell us whether a country is moving backward or preparing to move forward. The more important question is this: what happens after those imported goods arrive in Burkina Faso? Imagine trucks moving inland, carrying machinery, equipment, manufactured products, replacement parts, and other goods that businesses and communities need. Now imagine the other side of that trade relationship. Far fewer Burkina Faso-made goods are traveling back toward the United States. On paper, the imbalance is unmistakable. In 2025, the United States sold approximately $68.2 million in goods to Burkina Faso, while purchasing only about $5.1 million in return. But customs statistics cannot tell us the entire story. If imported equipment helps a farmer cultivate more land, it can increase future production. If machinery allows a local business to process crops instead of selling them raw, it can create additional value inside Burkina Faso. If productive inputs help businesses expand, today's imports can potentially contribute to tomorrow's jobs and exports. But there is another possibility. If Burkina Faso continues importing products that its own farmers and businesses could competitively produce at home, then the imbalance becomes much more difficult to ignore. That is the crossroads. Consider an ordinary farmer in Burkina Faso. He does not wake before sunrise thinking about a $63 million bilateral trade gap. He thinks about his land. He thinks about rainfall. He wonders whether fertilizer will arrive when it is needed, whether irrigation will reach his crops, whether equipment will be available before planting. And after months of work, he faces perhaps the most important question of all. Who will buy his harvest, and what will happen to it next? If that crop is sold cheaply without processing, much of its potential value disappears from the local economy. But if it can be stored, processed, packaged, transported, and eventually sold into larger markets, one harvest begins supporting far more than one farmer. That is where the meaning of economic sovereignty changes. It stops being a political slogan. It becomes a warehouse, a processing line, a working tractor, a reliable road, a market filled with products grown and transformed closer to home. This is also why self-reliance should not be confused with isolation. Burkina Faso cannot manufacture every machine it needs overnight. It cannot simply close its borders and expect prosperity to follow. International trade remains necessary. The strategic challenge is far more demanding. Import what strengthens national production today while building the capacity to competitively produce more at home tomorrow. Under Ibrahim Traoré, that philosophy has become increasingly important to Burkina Faso's broader push for economic sovereignty. But there is still a test that speeches cannot answer. Production has to rise. Farmers have to deliver, markets have to work, and value has to remain inside the economy. So which number should matter more? The 25.4% rise in American exports, or what Burkina Faso manages to produce with the capacity it is trying to build? Because in 2025, something else began moving faster than the trade imbalance itself. Burkina Faso's agricultural production was rising, and what happened in those fields may completely change how we understand this trade story. The trade numbers tell us what crossed the border, but to understand where Burkina Faso may be heading, we have to leave the customs reports behind. We have to go to the fields. Because while the goods trade gap with the United States was widening, another part of Burkina Faso's economy was moving in the opposite direction. Production was rising. In 2025, Burkina Faso's economy was estimated to grow by approximately 5.3%. Agriculture was one of the major contributors to that expansion. Cereal production was estimated to rise by approximately 17.6%, supported by favorable rainfall and government agricultural initiatives. That number matters because for Burkina Faso, agriculture is not simply another economic sector. It is food, it is employment, it is rural income, it is transportation. It is local commerce, and increasingly, it is becoming part of a much larger national strategy. Picture the scene. Early morning light stretches across farmland. Workers move through fields before the heat rises. Farmers inspect crops that months earlier were only seeds in dry soil. Small machines move between cultivated areas. Bags of grain are loaded. Motorcycles and trucks carry produce toward local markets. In towns farther away, traders prepare for another day of buying and selling. There is nothing dramatic about a single sack of maize, nothing spectacular about one field of rice. But when production begins rising across an economy, those ordinary scenes can become the foundation of something much larger. Burkina Faso has been pursuing an agricultural strategy that places greater emphasis on domestic production and several strategic value chains: rice, maize, wheat, potatoes, mangoes, fish, cattle, poultry. Each one represents more than food. Each one represents an opportunity to replace part of what might otherwise be imported. Each one can become the beginning of a domestic supply chain. And this is where the economic argument becomes much more interesting. For years, one of Africa's deepest structural problems has been painfully familiar. Grow something, extract something, sell it in a relatively low value form, then buy back a processed or manufactured version at a higher price. The country produces the raw material. Someone else captures more of the value. That cycle has shaped economies across the continent for generations. Burkina Faso is now trying to challenge that logic, not by abandoning trade, not by pretending the outside world is unnecessary, but by asking a different question. Why should more of the value not stay here? Why should maize stop at the harvest? Why should mangoes stop at the farm gate? Why should cattle represent only livestock when they can also support processing, transport, refrigeration, packaging, and regional commerce? This is the turning point. Economic sovereignty cannot simply be announced from a podium. It has to be produced, field by field, harvest by harvest, workshop by workshop, enterprise by enterprise. That is also why Ibrahim Traoré's economic message resonates with many supporters far beyond Burkina Faso. For them, sovereignty is not only about flags, speeches, military alliances, or diplomatic disputes. It is about whether an African country can feed more of its own people, whether local producers can compete, whether young workers can find opportunity without leaving home, whether a farmer can become part of an industry instead of remaining trapped at the lowest value point of the supply chain. And there is another reason this moment creates such powerful emotion. The story is not only about Burkina Faso. Across Africa, millions of people have watched their countries export enormous agricultural and mineral wealth while still importing products that were processed somewhere else. They know the frustration of seeing value leave. They understand what it means when local production remains weak. So when a country begins talking seriously about producing more, processing more, and keeping more economic value at home, people pay attention. Not because the transformation is complete. It is not. Not because every policy will succeed. It will not. And not because favorable weather, international markets, financing, and security suddenly stop mattering. They still matter enormously. But direction matters too. And the direction is becoming clearer. Grow it, process it, package it, move it, trade it, keep more of the value at home. That is a very different economic philosophy from simply celebrating higher production numbers. It means looking at every harvest and asking what comes next. A farmer produces maize. Who stores it? Who mills it? Who packages it? Who transports it? Who sells it? Who earns the wages? Who owns the business? And how much of that value remains inside Burkina Faso? Those questions are where national pride meets economic reality. Because a nation does not become more self-reliant simply because its leaders say it should. It becomes more self-reliant when ordinary people can see productive capacity appearing around them. A warehouse where there was none. A processing plant where crops once left unprocessed. A road that connects farmers to markets. A local company that hires workers, a product on a shelf that carries more Burkinabe value than it did before. That is why the 17.6% rise in cereal production matters far beyond agriculture. It raises the possibility that Burkina Faso's answer to its trade imbalance may not begin at the border at all. It may begin in the soil. And if that soil can support stronger domestic industries, then today's imported machinery may become tomorrow's local production. Today's trade gap may become tomorrow's productive capacity. Today's farmer may become part of tomorrow's export economy. If economic independence begins somewhere, perhaps it does not begin inside a central bank. Perhaps it begins when a farmer looks at a harvest and realizes that what stands before him can feed not only a family, but a factory, a town, and eventually another country. But there is one problem. Growing more food solves only half the equation. Because unless Burkina Faso can store it, process it, package it, transport it, and sell it at higher value, much of that economic power can still slip away. So the next question becomes even more important. Can Burkina Faso turn an agricultural awakening into an industrial one? Growing more food is only the beginning. The harder question is what happens after the harvest. Because if Burkina Faso produces more maize, more rice, more mangoes, more livestock, and more fish, but still sends much of that value out in basic form, then the country has only solved part of the problem. The real transformation begins when agriculture starts feeding industry. Think about the chain. A farmer grows maize. That maize can be sold immediately as a raw crop, or it can be stored, milled, processed, packaged, transported, branded, sold in domestic markets, and eventually exported across the region. At every step, more value can be created inside Burkina Faso. More workers can be hired. More businesses can be built. More income can circulate locally, and more of the final price can remain inside the national economy. That is the difference between simply producing more and becoming more productive as a country. For many African economies, this has been one of the most difficult structural challenges. Raw materials leave, processed goods come back, the first transaction earns relatively little. The second costs much more. The same pattern can happen with agricultural products, minerals, food, and manufactured goods. That is why import substitution matters. But it has to be understood correctly. Import substitution does not mean Burkina Faso should stop buying from the United States. It does not mean closing the borders. It does not mean rejecting technology. And it does not mean pretending a country can suddenly manufacture every machine, every component, or every specialized product it needs. A smarter strategy is more selective. Import what strengthens production. Import what local companies cannot yet produce efficiently. Import machinery. Import productive equipment. Import technology. Import knowledge. Then use those imports to expand domestic capacity. That is where the trade story becomes much more interesting. The same imported machine that appears today as part of a trade deficit can, in theory, help reduce future dependence if it allows a Burkina-Faso business to produce locally tomorrow. A processing machine can increase the value of a crop. Cold storage can reduce losses. Better transport can connect a farmer to a market. Reliable electricity can keep a processing facility running. One investment can connect several parts of the economy at the same time. And that is where Ibrahim Traore's broader economic message becomes important. His government has repeatedly emphasized sovereignty, domestic production, stronger control over strategic sectors, and a greater role for national capacity. But slogans alone cannot create an industrial economy. Execution decides everything. Can storage expand fast enough? Can processing capacity grow? Can transportation improve? Can electricity remain reliable? Can small businesses get access to financing? Can farmers produce consistently enough to supply processors? Can security improve enough to protect movement, investment, and trade? Those are the real tests, and they are difficult. But if Burkina Faso can solve even part of them, the effects move far beyond farming. Consider one successful agricultural value chain. A farmer produces the crop, a driver moves it, a warehouse worker stores it, a technician maintains the equipment, a processor turns it into a higher value product. A packaging business prepares it for sale. A distributor moves it to shops. A retailer sells it. An exporter finds a market across the border. One harvest suddenly supports an entire network of jobs. That is how agriculture can become industrial policy. And that is why the next phase of Burkina Faso's transformation matters so much. The country does not simply need more output, it needs more value added. Because value added is where income deepens, where businesses grow, where skills improve, where tax revenue expands, and where a country begins to negotiate from a stronger economic position. Imagine the difference 5 years from now. Burkina Faso still imports advanced machinery, still trades with the United States, still buys products it cannot efficiently produce at home. But now more food is processed domestically. More agricultural products carry Burkinabe branding. More regional markets receive finished or semi-finished products instead of raw commodities. More local workers participate in the chain. In that scenario, trade has not disappeared. It has matured, and that is the deeper point. Economic sovereignty is not about eliminating trade. It is about changing what a country contributes to trade. It is about moving from buyer to producer, from raw supplier to processor, from dependence on finished imports to selective use of productive imports, from selling what nature provides to selling what national capacity creates. That transition will not happen automatically. Favorable rainfall can help 1 year. Good harvests can create momentum, but without storage, power, roads, financing, processing, and security, that momentum can disappear. So the challenge facing Burkina Faso is not simply whether it can grow more. The challenge is whether it can build an economic system around what it grows. And if it can, something unexpected becomes possible. America may not need to lose for Burkina Faso to win, because the real opportunity may be to transform the relationship itself from a narrow pattern of buying and selling into a deeper relationship built around production, investment, technology, and more balanced trade. And that raises the next question. If Burkina Faso starts moving higher up the value chain, how will Washington, the Sahel, and the rest of Africa respond? If Burkina Faso succeeds in moving higher up the value chain, the consequences will not stop at its borders. Washington would have to look at the relationship differently. Today, the United States enjoys a clear goods trade surplus with Burkina Faso. That reflects the fact that American companies sell far more goods into Burkina Faso than the United States buys back. But Burkina Faso is still a relatively small trading partner for the American economy. So the largest strategic question is not whether Washington can continue selling more. It is whether Burkina Faso can become a stronger market, a stronger producer, and eventually a stronger commercial partner. A more productive Burkina Faso could still buy American machinery. It could still need advanced equipment. It could still seek technology, logistics, financing, and specialized products from abroad. But the relationship would begin to change if Burkina Faso also developed more products of its own to sell. That would be a healthier form of trade, not a one-way dependence, not a zero-sum contest, but a relationship in which both sides bring more value to the table. And this is where the story becomes much larger than Burkina Faso. Across the Sahel, governments and citizens are watching experiments in sovereignty, agriculture, industrial policy, and regional cooperation. Mali is watching. Niger is watching. Neighboring West African economies are watching. And many ordinary Africans are asking the same basic question. Can a country strengthen national production without cutting itself off from the world? Can it reduce vulnerability without rejecting trade? Can it use foreign equipment and capital as tools rather than allowing imported goods to permanently replace local capacity? If Burkina Faso begins to show that this is possible, even in limited areas, other countries may study the model, not copy it blindly, but examine what worked. Which crops gained scale? Which processing industries survived? Which roads connected producers to markets? Which policies created real businesses instead of short-lived projects? Those details matter because pride without execution is temporary, and ambition without infrastructure can disappear quickly. Burkina Faso still faces serious obstacles. Security remains a major constraint. Financing remains difficult. Energy supply matters. Transportation matters. Climate conditions matter. Administrative capacity matters. And not every government program will deliver the results promised. But that is precisely why the agricultural story matters. It gives people something measurable to watch. Production, processing, jobs, regional sales, domestic substitution. These are not abstract ideas. They can be tracked, they can rise, they can fail, and they can improve. For many Africans, that makes the current moment deeply significant. For decades, the continent has been described mainly as a supplier of raw materials and a buyer of finished products. The emerging aspiration is different. Africa wants to trade with the world from a stronger position, not only with gold in the ground, not only with crops, living farms, but with processed food, regional brands, industrial capability, transport networks, African companies, and stronger domestic markets. That is why Burkina Faso's direction matters beyond its size. If the country can move even a portion of its agriculture from raw output toward higher value production, the lesson could travel. First across the Sahel, then across West Africa, and perhaps further. The message would not be that Africa no longer needs the world. The message would be that Africa wants greater control over what it contributes to the world. And that creates one final question. 5 years from now, will the most important number still be how much Burkina Faso buys from the United States? Or will the world be watching how much Burkina Faso has finally learned to produce, process, and sell on its own terms? The story began with one striking number. United States goods exports to Burkina Faso jumped by more than 25% in 2025. But by the end of this journey, that number means something very different. Because the real question is no longer simply how much Burkina Faso buys from America. The real question is what Burkina Faso is building while those imports are arriving. That is where the future will be decided. If agricultural production rises but storage does not improve, crops can still lose value. If farmers produce more but processing remains weak, much of the economic benefit can still leave the country. If roads remain unreliable, markets stay disconnected. If electricity is unstable, factories struggle. If financing is unavailable, small businesses cannot expand. And if security does not improve, investment becomes harder and regional trade becomes more fragile. This is the warning. Agricultural momentum can create hope, but only an economic system can turn that hope into lasting strength. That system has to connect the farmer to the warehouse to the processor to the road to the market, and the market to the wider region. Now, imagine what that could mean. A farmer who once sold a raw harvest begins supplying a local processor. A Burkinabe company packages that product. A driver carries it across a regional trade corridor. Workers earn wages from the movement of that one crop. Businesses pay taxes. Local skills grow. More value remains inside the country. And suddenly, agriculture becomes something bigger than food. It becomes a foundation for sovereignty. That is the deeper economic test facing Ibrahim Traoré and Burkina Faso. Not whether the country can stop buying from the United States, not whether Burkina Faso can isolate itself from global commerce, but whether it can become strong enough to trade with America, Africa, and the rest of the world from a position of greater productive confidence. So when you see that roughly $63.1 million goods trade gap, what do you see? A warning that Burkina Faso is still too dependent on what others produce, or the early cost of a transition that could eventually create stronger farms, stronger businesses, more processing, and more exports? Tell us your answer in the comments.
And if you believe Africa's economic future deserves serious coverage beyond the headlines, like this video, share it, and subscribe for our next Burkina Faso analysis.
The future will not be decided by one trade report. It will be decided by what gets planted, what gets processed, what gets built, and what Africans ultimately own. That is why this story matters. Because if Burkina Faso can turn agricultural momentum into industrial capacity, then the most important number 5 years from now may not be what the country imports. It may be what Burkina Faso has learned to produce, transform, and sell on its own terms. And that leaves us with one final question. Can Ibrahim Traoré turn Burkina Faso's agricultural awakening into the beginning of a stronger, more self-reliant economic future? May God bless Burkina Faso, Africa, and all those working for dignity, opportunity, and a more prosperous future.